There are people who, no matter how many years pass, remain a quiet presence in our hearts. They were once everything: the smile on sunny days, the shoulder to lean on during rainy days, the dreams we believed would last forever. But life pushes us down different paths, and one day, when we meet again, we realize they have become a familiar stranger. We smile, exchange polite questions, talk about work, about life, as if the distance of time had never existed. But deep down, there is something unspoken, that once, a single glance was enough to understand each other. Now, let's listen to the story, Familiar Stranger. Perhaps not everyone who walks with us through our youth will stay until the end. Some loves don't end with anger, but with the silence of time. But the beautiful thing is, even if we no longer hold hands, we can still keep them in our hearts, like a gentle memory, like an old song that still stirs something inside us every time we hear it again. Please join us in listening to a true story about emotions and love, titled Familiar Stranger. The small bell on the door jingled as Ethan stepped into the bookstore. A comforting warmth, mixed with the scent of old paper, enveloped him, as if he had just walked into another world. Quiet, nostalgic, and somehow both unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. He wandered past the towering bookshelves, his fingers absent-mindedly grazing the worn spines of the books. It had been a long time since he had set foot in a place like this. The fast-paced life in New York had made him forget the feeling of holding a real book rather than scrolling through a screen. Behind the counter, a woman was carefully stacking books onto the shelves. She wore a cream-colored sweater, her brown hair loosely tied back, with a few soft curls falling against her cheek. There was something about her that made Ethan pause for a moment. It wasn't that she was particularly striking or extraordinary, but there was a strange familiarity about her, like he had met her somewhere before. But he quickly brushed the thought aside. In a city of millions, it wasn't unusual for someone to resemble a face from the past. He continued browsing, stopping in front of an old bookshelf. A worn leather-bound book caught his attention, The Catcher in the Rye. Classic. A piece of his youth. As he pulled the book from the shelf, a folded piece of paper unexpectedly slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Instinctively, Ethan bent down to pick it up and unfolded it. The slanted handwriting on the faded paper came into focus. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means I was too much of a coward to give it to you. I don't know how to say this, but I think I've liked you for a very long time." Ethan's breath hitched. A wave of memories crashed into him like an unexpected tide. It was a name he hadn't thought about in years. And now, as he looked up, the woman behind the counter was staring at him too, her expression a mix of surprise and uncertainty, as if she had just stumbled upon a long-lost fragment of her past. Claire took the letter from Ethan's hand, her eyes scanning the smudged words on the yellowed paper. As she read the first few lines, her brows furrowed slightly. The handwriting, it was familiar. She had seen it countless times before, scribbled in notebooks, on little notes passed between desks in class. She lifted her gaze to the man standing before her. "I'm sorry, where did you find this?" Her voice was gentle but hesitant. Ethan blinked, that odd sense of familiarity washing over him again. "It fell out of The Catcher in the Rye," he said, nodding toward the bookshelf. "I guess someone left it there a long time ago." Claire let out a soft chuckle and shook her head. "Yes, a very long time ago." She folded the letter, but her fingers lingered on the edges as if trying to grasp a piece of the past. Ethan watched her closely. There was something about this woman that made it impossible for him to look away. It wasn't just her features, it was the feeling, a sensation he couldn't quite name. He looked at her more carefully, the warm brown eyes, the delicate curve of her nose, the way her lips lifted slightly when she smiled. A face that seemed to be imprinted in his memory, yet for some reason he couldn't place it. Do you read The Catcher in the Rye often? Claire asked suddenly, pulling him back to the present. Ethan nodded. I used to. It was my favorite book in high school. Claire tilted her head slightly. Really? I loved it too. Ethan smiled. Did you? A brief silence settled between them. Ethan found himself wondering, why did he feel so at ease talking to her? It was as if he was reconnecting with an old friend rather than speaking with a stranger. Did you grow up around here? Claire asked, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Ethan hesitated. Actually, I did. But I left after high school. Claire blinked. Which school did you go to? Ethan shrugged. Brookfield High. A long time ago. Claire froze. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression. First surprise, then a flicker of uncertainty, and finally, something that resembled recognition. Brookfield High. Her voice grew quieter. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Why? Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then, all of a sudden, she laughed, a light, clear laugh, like a breeze carrying whispers from the past. Ethan frowned. What's so funny? Claire shook her head, but the smile lingered on her lips. She took a deep breath, as if trying to piece together her thoughts. Then she met his gaze and said, Back in high school, I had a very close friend. A boy who always carried The Catcher in the Rye with him. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. He loved writing letters but never had the courage to send them, Claire continued. And he had this strange little habit. He would always wrap his earphone cord around his wrist, even when he wasn't listening to music. Ethan instinctively glanced down at his wrist. Even now, though he wasn't wearing headphones, he still had the same habit. His fingers lightly coiling around his wrist as if an invisible cord were still there. He looked up, and when their eyes met, a flood of memories crashed over him. Claire? He whispered as if he couldn't quite believe his own words. Claire smiled, tilting her head slightly. Hello, Ethan. And in that moment, everything became clear. The girl who used to sit beside him in English class. The friend who had spent endless summer afternoons exploring their small town with him. The person who had once meant the world to him, only to be lost in the currents of time. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. 100 questions swirled in his mind, yet he didn't know where to begin. In the end, he could only manage a simple, breathless question. Is it really you? Claire laughed softly. It's really me. Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. You've changed so much. Claire shrugged. And you're just the same. They looked at each other, and in that instant, the 25 years between them seemed to shrink into nothing. The old memories came rushing back. Laughter, late-night conversations, walks along the red brick streets of their town. And all the things left unsaid. Ethan looked at the letter in Claire's hand, feeling his heart pound. Do you remember? He hesitated. The last time we saw each other? Claire nodded, her gaze softening. I remember. It was the summer before graduation. You promised to meet me that night, but you never came. Ethan lowered his head. He remembered. He remembered sitting in his room, letter in hand, torn between giving it to her or keeping it to himself. He had written everything. His feelings, his fears, and the hope that she might feel the same way. But in the end, he hadn't dared. He hadn't shown up. And the next day, he had left town, leaving everything behind. Ethan took a deep breath. I was afraid. Claire watched him, waiting. I was afraid that if I gave you this letter, if I told you everything, I would lose you. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. But it turns out, by staying silent, I lost you anyway. A silence settled between them. Then Claire smiled, not a sad smile, but one that was gentle and understanding. Well, in the end, you did give it to me. She held up the letter. Ethan smiled back. In the end. Once again, they looked at each other, And this time, there was no doubt, no hesitation. Just two people who had once been everything to each other, now standing face to face as strangers, but with hearts still beating to the same rhythm. Their story wasn't over. Perhaps this was only the beginning. The air in the bookstore was thick with the scent of old memories, but time had not stood still. Ethan and Claire were no longer the carefree teenagers they once were. Now they were two adults, carrying the weight of their own stories, their own scars. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter, offering Claire a wistful smile. "So, how has life been for you all these years?" Claire slowly placed the letter into a drawer behind the counter, as if needing a moment to gather her thoughts. Then she smiled, though there was a quiet sadness in it. "Nothing too extraordinary," she said. "I never left this town. After college, I came back and worked at the library for a while. Then I got married, had a daughter, but my husband passed away early." Ethan stiffened slightly. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I didn't know." She shook her head. "It's okay. It was a long time ago. My daughter is grown now. She's in college in another state. I opened this bookstore a few years ago, just to keep myself busy and have something to love." Ethan was silent for a moment, as if trying to picture Claire's life over the years. A part of him felt guilty, because when he left, he never looked back. He had no idea what had happened to her, what she had been through. "What about you?" Claire asked, cutting through his thoughts. "What did you do after you left?" Ethan let out a small smile, but it was the smile of a man who had seen too much. "I moved to New York, went to college, then worked in finance. Everything happened so fast. Work, big deals, then I got married, but eventually we divorced." Claire blinked. "I didn't know you had been married." "Yeah," Ethan nodded. "She was a wonderful person, but in the end, we realized we wanted different things in life. Maybe I was never truly all in on that marriage." Claire tilted her head, her gaze both gentle and piercing. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked down at his hands, then met her eyes. "Maybe a part of me always thought about this town. And about you." Claire took a quiet breath but said nothing. Ethan continued, his voice lower. "I always thought about that night. The night I was supposed to meet you." She tightened her grip on the counter, her eyes shadowed with memories. "You didn't just not show up. You never wrote, never called. It was like you completely disappeared." Ethan closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. "I know. And that's something I've always regretted." "So why, Ethan?" Claire asked. Her voice held no anger, just a need for an answer. He took a deep breath. "I was scared, Claire." She frowned. "Scared of what?" "Scared that if I told you how I felt, everything would change forever," Ethan said slowly. "Scared that if you didn't feel the same, I'd lose my best friend. And most of all, I was scared that if I stayed, I'd never chase my dreams." Claire studied him for a long moment. "You thought if you told me you'd lose me. But in the end, you lost me anyway, didn't you?" Ethan let out a sad laugh. "Yeah." Silence settled between them. Outside the window, streetlights flickered on as dusk settled in. Pedestrians walked along the sidewalk, some stepping into the cafe across the street, others hurrying home. But inside the small bookstore, time seemed to stand still. "What about you, Claire?" Ethan suddenly asked. "Did you ever think about leaving this town?" Claire smiled softly. "I did. But then I fell in love with this place. It's my home. And when my husband passed away, I couldn't leave. My daughter grew up here, and I wanted her to have a stable childhood." Ethan nodded. He understood. Claire's life was simple yet profound, while he had spent too many years chasing things that, in the end, felt meaningless. He glanced around the bookstore, the tall shelves, the worn-out novels, the small desk lamp on the counter. It wasn't as glamorous as the skyscrapers of New York, nor as exhilarating as his high-stakes meetings. But it had something those things never did: peace. "Did you ever think about me?" Ethan asked suddenly. Claire was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I did." Ethan swallowed hard. "Then, what if I hadn't left that day? Would things have been different?" Claire looked at him, her gaze warm but grounded in reality. "Maybe." She smiled gently. "But the past is the past, Ethan. We can't change it." Ethan nodded, but something stirred inside him, a mix of regret and a glimmer of hope. "But we still have the present," he said. Claire looked at him, then smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "we still have the present." And maybe that was the most important thing. Ethan held her gaze, his eyes filled with something both familiar and distant. He had looked at her like this once, on a late summer afternoon, beneath the old oak tree behind their high school, when they were just dream-filled teenagers. But now they were no longer those carefree kids. Time had changed them, shaping them with heartbreak and loss. "Claire," Ethan spoke, his voice steady yet deliberate. "I don't want to just be an old memory to you. I want to start over." Claire looked at him, her heart tightening. Years ago, those words would have made her overjoyed. But now, after everything, she wasn't sure she could trust Ethan again. "We've changed too much, Ethan," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't just come back and pretend like nothing happened." Ethan exhaled deeply. "I know, but that doesn't mean we can't begin again." Claire lowered her gaze, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the worn surface of the wooden counter. A part of her wanted to believe him, but another part reminded her that he had once left without a word. What guarantee was there that he wouldn't do it again? A memory that returned unbidden. That night, Claire sat on the couch in her small apartment behind the bookstore. She reached for an old wooden box on the shelf, a place where she kept the most important pieces of her past. She opened it, flipping through letters from her late husband, birthday cards from her daughter, until her fingers stopped on an old photograph, one that had yellowed with time. In the photograph, she and Ethan stood side by side on their high school football field, both laughing brightly, their hair tousled by the wind. Claire remembered that day well. It was the day they had promised each other that no matter what happened, they would always be a part of each other's lives. She traced the edges of the photo lightly, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. Her daughter's questions. The next morning, Claire video called her daughter, Emily, as she did every weekend. "You look tired, Mom," Emily observed through the screen. "Are you okay?" Claire smiled. "It's nothing, sweetheart. I just ran into an old friend." Emily tilted her head curiously. "An old friend? Who?" Claire hesitated for a moment, then said, "Ethan." There was a pause. Then Emily suddenly giggled. "Wait, is this the Ethan from your old stories? The one who ran soaking wet into the library just to bring you an umbrella?" Claire laughed. "Yes, that's him." Emily blinked. "So, are you two getting back together?" Claire's breath hitched. "No, honey. It's nothing like that. That was a long time ago." Emily was quiet for a moment before saying gently, "But if you still think about him after all these years, maybe he still means something to you, doesn't he?" Claire froze. The feelings she couldn't ignore. After the call, Claire sat by the window, watching people pass by on the small street below. Emily's words echoed in her mind. She had always believed Ethan was just a part of her past, a beautiful but unreachable memory. But now that he was back, she realized that a part of her had never truly forgotten him. No matter the heartbreak, no matter the pain, the feelings were still there. The only question was she ready to open her heart again? Claire walked slowly along the quiet street, the glow of the streetlights casting a soft golden hue on the sidewalk. She had been lost in thought since seeing Ethan again. Memories she thought had been long buried suddenly resurfaced, leaving her torn between holding on and letting go. Ethan was waiting for her at the familiar cafe, the one where they had once spent hours talking about their dreams when they were young. When Claire stepped inside, he was already there, stirring his coffee, his eyes gazing absently out the window. She sat across from him. "You got here early?" Ethan smiled slightly. "I knew you'd come." The air between them was no longer tense, but it wasn't entirely easy either. They both knew this conversation would determine everything, whether they could move forward together or not. Looking back at the past, facing the present, Ethan was the first to speak. "Claire, I don't want to pressure you into any decision. But I need to know, do you think we have a chance to start over?" Claire clasped her hands together, looking deep into Ethan's eyes. She saw sincerity in them, but she also saw something else, a distance that time had created. "I've thought a lot about this, Ethan," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "About the past, about what we once had, and what we lost." Ethan remained silent, waiting. Claire took a deep breath. "I still cherish those memories, and I will always remember them as a beautiful part of my life. But we're not the same people we were back then." Ethan lowered his gaze, pressing his lips together. "I understand. You built a different life, and so did I," Claire continued. "What once connected us, our dreams, our promises, isn't the same anymore. And I'm not sure we can go back and pretend as if nothing ever happened." Ethan smiled sadly. "I guess I was hoping too much." Claire shook her head. "It's not about hoping too much. Sometimes, the past just needs to stay where it belongs." A farewell without regret. A silence fell between them. But it wasn't heavy, it was one of acceptance. Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm really glad I got to see you again." Claire smiled. "Me too. I used to be so angry at you for leaving without a word. But now, I think I can finally forgive you." Ethan exhaled, relieved. "Thank you, Claire. That means a lot to me." They looked at each other one last time, as if memorizing every detail of the person sitting across from them. There were no more regrets, no more unanswered questions. They had found closure. As they left the cafe, Ethan turned to Claire. "Maybe one day, we'll cross paths again." Claire smiled, a soft yet certain smile. "Maybe. But no matter what, I wish you happiness." Ethan nodded. "I wish you happiness too." They walked away in opposite directions. But this time, it wasn't a departure filled with regret, it was a farewell filled with peace. Because they both knew that even if they couldn't go back, the beautiful memories would always remain.